big denominational leaders from around the world who converged on India to something to do with William Carey, the father of modern missions, commemorating that. They all converged on India, and they asked Gandhi, who's not a Christian, to speak at their conference. I don't understand all that, but he stood up and he said, "I like your Christ." Mahatma Gandhi, great leader in India, stood up, this delegation of leaders from all the world, and said, "I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians."
Come on.
They seem so different than your Christ. I thought, oh God, what an indictment. You know what will change that? The glory of God. People desiring it, people longing for it, people going on after it, people taking 7 nights just to have a prayer revival, desperate for a touch from God, desperate like Moses, bold enough to say, "Show me thy glory." That's what's going to change it. Because and Gandhi did get to see some people like that, and it affected him and moved him. I wish it would have affected him more. But that stuck with me. I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. I thought, that's an indictment against me. It's an indictment against the church. But what happened here in Moses' day, when the people traded the glory for the gold, God moved outside the camp. The same thing is happening. Do you really think God is impressed with the big buildings that in many cases are nothing more than monuments to man? Do you really think God's impressed with that? Do you really think God's impressed with huge crowds that flock to hear some motivational speaker who has the audacity to call himself a preacher of the gospel? Do you really think God's impressed with the bigness of it all? If he was, he would have come down on the side of the false prophets in Jeremiah's day instead of upholding and supporting Jeremiah, because the crowds weren't going with Jeremiah. And Jeremiah was going to build any big buildings. They treated him shamefully. He was despised and rejected, just like Jesus would be. But history lets us know where God was at. And I pray we'll be delivered from being impressed by bigness and being intimidated by bigness, so that we can see what God's really after. Now, I like to see growth like that in the early church. They had big churches, and they had big churches because God was moving, the glory of God was there. But the big buildings, the big meetings, it doesn't impress God, especially when preachers go in, take on massive debt, and then have to spend 45 minutes of their hour or longer, or 25 minutes of their half hour on television, finding new ways to beg for money or plead for money or manipulate you to get money so they can pay for their time and so they can pay for their big buildings, and not much time left to be involved with fulfilling the Great Commission. If there's anybody that's lost that you haven't turned off by your approach and your attitude towards money, where it would even matter that you try to... Do you see what I'm saying? That's what's happened to American Christianity. And instead of thinking you're just a little church out in Richwoods, maybe you ought to be thinking, you know what? God's not as impressed with some of that as people are. And what Jesus is concerned about is that somehow the glory of God touched my life, and that I get serious about fulfilling the Great Commission. I remember it's the Great Commission, not the Great Suggestion. And that the way Jesus advocated winning the world was with foot soldiers going out one-on-one, confronting people. Now that's all, Brother Clinton used to say, that's all but a lost art. Confrontation. Confront somebody with, confront somebody with the gospel. That's what they did in the book of Acts. They went out and confronted the culture. They didn't back up. They didn't bow down. They didn't let people they thought were intelligent, more intelligent than they are because they had all the letters behind their name, unlearned and ignorant men. That's what the great educated religious leaders said about Peter and the others, unlearned and ignorant men. But they took note of them. Why? Because they had been with Jesus. They didn't let their lack of education cause them to back up and say, ooh, He's got a TD behind his name. I'm the guy who came. I brought the guy down. I thought, who do you think you are? I brought you here. But he wanted to impress everybody because he had his doctor of divinity. Well, hats off to people who really earn a doctor of divinity. It's not an easy thing to do. I've got a few letters behind my name that I don't advertise, but I had to work for them. I didn't send off to a paper mill and give them $25 and get my little certificate. I worked for them. But you know something? That guy, he just kept going on. I said, well, I have my DD also. Whoa, all of a sudden he's impressed. He didn't realize that he was in the presence of someone who also had letters behind his name. You know, I've got a few other letters too, but at the end of the line, I can say that I can put DD. He said, really? I said, yes. I'm a devil driver. I got my DD in devil driving. But you know what? Oh, God help us. We got to stop being impressed with things that don't impress God. And realize God's just looking for some people that are hungry and thirsty, that are serious about living this life, that are bold enough to pray like Moses prayed. God, show me your glory. God moved outside the camp of mainstream Christianity a long time ago. The real tragedy is that so many people are sitting in mega churches in the United States of America and don't even realize that God doesn't attend the services anymore. Do you really think that could be possible? Here, since some of your, I always say, Henry Ford said thinking is hard work. That's why so few people do it. And some of you are probably, maybe I'm trying to make you think more than you want to today. But do you think it's possible that the great falling away is already occurring? The great falling away that Jesus and the apostles said would have to happen before the return of Jesus? Everybody's waiting and looking. They said, well, the great falling away is just up the road. I think the great falling away is already happening. People just don't recognize it. People think the great falling away means the church buildings will be empty. Well, in some cases they are. But you know what? People are falling away from God in this country and never leaving church. Churches are filled with people who've fallen away. The great falling away has already happened. The great falling away happens when there's no reverence for the presence of God, when there's no reverence for the glory of God, when there's no realization of the need for the Holy Ghost. People have fallen away from real Christianity, from New Testament Christianity. If you don't realize that there's an absolute necessity for the fullness of the Holy Ghost, then you fall away from New Testament Christianity. You can say what you want. And we're farther down the road. But God moved outside the camp. Those who were hungry and thirsty and wanted God moved with them. Moses went out. The people watched them. They saw that's where the glory was. Where do we go from here? We go where the presence goes. Where's the presence going? I don't know. But I'm going to keep looking. I'm going to keep seeking. I want to see the glory of God as it's revealed in the face of Jesus Christ. But I know if I go out after His presence, if I go out after His glory, it may not be the popular route. It wasn't the popular route to identify with Jeremiah in his day. Do you realize that how few people hung out with Jeremiah and how many people hung out with the false prophets of his day? I mean, it was like the mega church situation today. Or you might find out if you go out after the presence and you really pursue the glory, it might take you to Potiphar's house before you ever get to the palace. It might even take you to prison. And like Joseph, you might be in prison thinking, what happened? Where did I go wrong? Where did I miss it? Oh God. But in that place, he still kept seeking God. And finally, it got him to the palace where God intended for him to be all along. You don't know where it's going to take you. It won't be the smooth, easy road that so many people seem to think it's going to be. But if you follow the presence, if you pursue it with diligence, if you pursue it with all your heart, ultimately it will take you to the fulfillment of your destiny. And there's no better place to arrive than the fulfillment of your destiny in God. There's no greater activity